Well, good afternoon. I'd like to continue in my analysis of the French Revolution by focusing on the four phases of the revolution, and its consequences, and its aftermath. I do consider the French Revolution to have four phases because I do consider the Napoleonic period, the Napoleonic era, as one of the phases of the French Revolution. Its consolidation rather than its end. But we shall see, and hopefully, if you appreciate the topic, you will listen to my other podcasts on my channel regarding the French Revolution and Napoleonic era. And if you like it, please subscribe to the channel and give me a like. And please comment. I do read all the comments, and I'm very interested in the opinions of my audience. So thank you in advance. And here we go in terms of the French Revolution and its phases. Um, I want to start with the moderate phase of the French Revolution, that being the period between 1789 and 1792. And of course, the French Revolution is provoked uh, by a fiscal and taxing crisis that engulfs the French government under Louis XVI. From about 1786 on, there are other contributing factors to the crisis: bad harvests, a fear in the countryside concerning famine, and the exercise of feudal privilege. But these all result in Louis from 1786 on trying to deal with a fiscal imbalance in the French budget that ballooned to the point where it bankrupted the French government as a result of wars, said bad harvest, a slowing economy. All of these things contributed to the crisis. Louis tried to initially address the fiscal crisis by pleading with the aristocracy, the Second Estate, to agree to fiscal and tax reform. But the aristocracy proved obdurate and opposed all of Louis's attempts to reform, forcing Louis to fire certain reformist ministers that he had named to deal with the crisis, particularly Jacques Necker, who tried to reform the system of taxation and fiscal crisis, deal with the fiscal crisis in France, but was driven out of office by the opposition of the aristocracy and other sectors of the French feudal structure. Louis was then, as a last recourse, basically turned to the Estates General. He had to call the Estates General, which was the something equivalent to the British Parliament or the Spanish Cortes, a feudal structure which had three estates: the first estate being the clergy, the second estate being the nobility, and the third estate, everyone else, were about 97% of the people of France. The overall population of France in 1789 is estimated at 27 to 28 million. 26 to 20, about 20, between 25 and 26 million were peasants. France was essentially an agrarian state, but these had no feudal privileges whatsoever. And the other members of the third estate, the bourgeoisie, the professional middle class, and the urban and poor, basically had no feudal privileges, and this was the demarcation point between the first, second, and third estate. As I said, the first estate was the Roman Catholic Church, the second estate was the aristocracy, and the third estate, everyone else. Louis allowed elections for deputies to the convocation of the Third Estate at Versailles, the royal residence, and he allowed very expansive electorates to vote on the deputies. This was an attempt by Louis to increase the electorate and thereby hopefully bring in some of the more radical elements in the several estates because they were all divided in some way. The first estate was divided among between the high clergy and the bishops, archbishops, and cardinals who had significant feudal privileges, social standing, political power, and the church priests and deacons who were less alienated from their communities and had no such standing in the feudal order. The same thing with the second state, the aristocracy. They were divided between the nobles of the sword, the traditional nobility, and the bourgeois families that had bought titles of nobility under Louis XIV and his successors, who provided an administrative bureaucratic elite for the absolutist project initiated by Louis XIV. So there was division among the nobility. In addition to that, there was another layer of division between the high aristocracy and the lower nobles. And they all had differing views on the transformation of France or the lack of thereof. The third estate was also divided. As I said, 25 million peasants, but we shouldn't take peasants to mean that they were all poor or all oppressed. In fact, the peasants owned about 40% of the land in France, the aristocracy about 20% of the land, and the church 10% of the landed wealth, which was commensurate with the tithing obligations that their congregants had. But the peasantry, in fact, had groups that were essentially wealthy and owned quite a bit of land and could hire many workers to work on several estates. And they had accumulated wealth, but they lacked the feudal privileges against taxation and legal standing, differential legal standing that the aristocracy and the church enjoyed. There were also middling landowners among the peasantry, and they were basically the landowners that could carve out a decent living, middle class in the context of the agrarian sector. And then there were the poor, the day laborers, which were just barely eking out a living if they were doing that, and they were subjected to exploitation and oppression, and the levels of these different were different in the different regions of France, where you had larger and smaller estates and so on. But these estates are all represented at the convocation of the Estates General, which starts on May 5th, 1789. And as I said, Louis tried to scare the two feudal orders into perhaps accepting a quick fiscal and tax reform. But he misplayed his hand because from the very beginning, there were deputies in the Third Estate and some that came out of the Second and First Estate that advocated a wholesale transformation of France. An example of this is the pamphlet written by the Abbé Sieyès, who we will meet again in Napoleon's coup of Brumaire. But Sieyès in 1789 published a pamphlet, very influential one, where he asked, what is the Third Estate? And his conclusion was that the third estate, because it was the only productive one, that is the only group that contributed to the welfare of France, was indeed the nation. And it was the first definition of France as a national state. And this was a very, very influential pamphlet written by a priest, not of the high clergy, but a member of the First Estate. And it influenced many in the Third Estate to then take action. Because Louis had a problem with the voting system that was being called for, particularly by the Third Estate. They had most of the representatives, and they were demanding one deputy, one vote. Louis opposed that and tried to close the meetings, the sessions, by posting guards at the doors. But that backfired. On June 20th, 1789, the members of the Third Estate marched out to a tennis court in Versailles and swore an oath, not first claiming no longer to be the members of the Third Estate, but rather the National Constituent Assembly, and that they would not leave until they gave France a liberal constitution, essentially a constitutional monarchy, a constitution for a constitutional monarchy. That was the first salvo in the French Revolution. But as I said, there were many groups in the Third Estate, and one of these was the urban poor. And they also took action relatively quickly. July 14th, 1789, they stormed the royal prison of the Bastille in the middle of Paris. They took it and they slaughtered the royal guards. They didn't find too many prisoners at the Bastille. Nonetheless, they expended their pent-up emotions and hatred of the existing order by slaughtering the royal guards. This was also echoed throughout the countryside. The countryside experienced something known as the Great Fear, where peasants feared that they were going to be attacked by the nobility, or that the king was going to take violent reprisals against them. And they then attacked noble manors, burning them and burning any documentation requiring feudal obligations. By 1789, French nobles could no longer expect a feudal levy in labor, but they did have a right to payments in lieu of that labor. And this kind of spread, this fear, tension spread amongst the countryside. It was known as the Great Fear. Very quickly, following the Bastille, particularly the storming of the Bastille, on August 4th, nobles in the National Assembly renounced their feudal rights. That is, they suspended their feudal rights. And the Jacobin Club was formed in Paris. The Jacobin Club was a Republican club, a radical Republican club. And it was called Jacobin because they met in the former church of St. James, and therefore they earned the name Jacobin. It would be a momentous development, because Jacobin would basically be the name of radicals, kind of the nomenclature for radicalism in Europe would be known as Jacobin. And this was rather important. Following the August 4th, which was a night session, it's an eerie vision of these nobles marching up and kind of suspending their feudal rights after they had opposed all of Louis' attempts at simple tax and fiscal reform. But nonetheless, they did that. And some historians see that as the day that ended or the session that ended the feudal order in France. Following that, the August 27, 1789, you had the Declaration of the Rights of Man, 17 articles, essentially a Lockean document. Locke would be the dominant ideologist, dominant. Locke would provide the dominant political philosophy of the moderate phase of the revolution. The bourgeoisie dominated this phase, and therefore they were interested in Locke's ideas that government was established as a contract between the government and the people in order to secure for the people indivisible and rights to life, liberty, and property. And this was essentially Locke's liberal ideology, which also called for limited government, in the protection of individual rights procedurally and legally, and the recognition of the sanctity of property. This was rather important. And the articles of the Declaration of the Rights of Man basically accept Locke's ideas, although the article on property does move to a Rousseauist concept of equality, not liberty, as the basis for government or for the contract underlying government, because that article calls property or legitimizes property only insofar as it has a public value, a public purpose. And therefore, it kind of fuzzies the whole idea of the sanctity of property, which is Rousseau's. Rousseau basically argued for equality rather than individual rights. And Rousseau also argued for authoritarian government in order to promote egalitarianism in society, social, political, and economic. The two most forcefully, the third also envisioned. And then you had a situation where the women of Paris again march, and they march to Versailles, where they take the king and his family and they forcibly return them from Versailles to Paris, where they're interned almost in house imprisonment at the Tuileries Palace in Paris. And this again shows you how there are two parallel courses in the revolution, one driven by the streets, which acts as an engine for further radicalization, and one that sits at Versailles trying to structure a liberal constitution. But they kind of affect each other in the process. Then, of course, you had the enactment of the civil constitution of the clergy, and this is momentous in July 12, 1790, because what happens then is that the church, which enjoyed all these feudal privileges and had a traditional order that tied it to the Pope, was denied that. And they basically had to swear allegiance to the revolutionary state. And this divided the church, and it also began to break apart the revolutionary coalition, the wide front, popular front that existed, that had brought together the bourgeoisie, the peasantry, most of the peasants, together in opposition to feudal privilege. Because the peasants, although they were diverse in their social and economic points of view and agenda, they basically were not anti-clerical. The bourgeoisie and the professional middle class that spread the ideas of the Enlightenment were essentially anti-clerical. And their anti-clerical actions begin to radicalize the revolution even further, and it alienates the peasantry. And this is an important alienation because it begins a great deal of internal opposition to the revolution, You had the rising in the western sections of France, particularly the Vendée. You had a Catholic rising, a royalist Catholic rising, which essentially creates an internal military opposition to the revolution, and it's driven by this anti-clerical focus on of the revolutionaries. And this is something that even the more moderate groups in the moderate phase favor. The anti-clericalism of the revolutionaries is rooted in its acceptance of the Enlightenment principles, developed by Voltaire and Diderot, calling the church a bulwark or a defender of the absolutist feudal order, and challenging its tenets, its religious tenets, as superstition. And this does permeate the revolutionary corridors, and it leads to, for example, the elimination of the calendar. The traditional calendar is changed. The year one, 1789 becomes the year one. The months are renamed on the basis of their association with weather, rather than the traditional names of the month, which are done away with. And then the week itself is restructured. It eliminates a 7-day week with Sunday as a day of religious ritual and rest, with a 10-day system that tries to fuzzy or obfuscates Sunday. It also the Enlightenment leads to this rationalism, extreme rationalism, where the regions of France are done away with and replaced with 87 rectangular departments. This idea of order and rationalism, almost mathematical precision, permeates. As this happens, the revolution becomes much more radical. The threat to the king then awakens a declaration by the King of Prussia and the Austrian Emperor, who happens to be the brother of Marie Antoinette, the Queen of France. And this is the Declaration of Pilsnitz, where both of these monarchs call upon other monarchs in Europe to defend the cause of the French king and to restore the French king against the revolutionaries. It is the beginnings of a European reaction, military reaction to the French Revolution, and the revolutionaries use it to further radicalize their programs. It also creates major problems within the revolution. The battle, the war, an international war that initially goes badly for the French, a kind of energetic internal opposition, which is violent in some areas, to the revolution, and seems to permeate society, and then a faltering and in many cases collapsing economy. So this begins to demand more radical solutions to those three problems. So while this period is dominated by the bourgeoisie with the support of the landed peasantry in opposition to aristocratic privilege, the revolutionary leadership tried to implement the reforms of John Locke. And in fact, in the Constitution of 1791, they actually develop a constitutional framework that is Lockean in nature. That is, it calls for limited government, indirect participation by the electorate in the political process, and it's all based and limited by tax liability. That is, the amount of tax liability that one has determines the level of participation that one has in government, from voting to actually becoming an officer of government. So it's and it has a two-house legislature with the king as a weak executive, a constitutional monarchy with a strong but limited legislature. It's a two-house legislature always is less radical than one-house legislature, which will come during the radical phase. So they do that. But however, anti-clericalism and the violent actions of the urban poor begin to both erode revolutionary consensus and provoke a hostile foreign reaction. And the hostile foreign reaction also then promotes radical solutions. So now I want to turn to the radical phase because the radicals basically take charge after 1792. And so in 1792, you have the radical phase of the French Revolution. And the radical phase was led by an increasingly revolutionary cadre of middle-class leaders uh, uniting in political clubs such as the Girondists. They were all Jacobins, but the Girondists and the Mountain were basically two groups within the Jacobin club. The Girondins being regional were somewhat less radical, simply because they did not base their political power on the backs of the Paris mob. The Mountain, that group, was supported by the Paris mob and therefore much more radical. Um, they were greatly influenced by the writings of Rousseau, and they supported universal suffrage. That is, one man, one vote, which was not the case in the moderate phase of the revolution. They basically came to power to solve the three problems I mentioned before. That is the prosecution of the war, elimination of internal opposition, and established public control of the economy. These policies reflected a democratic radicalism that favored a purely secular state and also an authoritarian state. They opposed the liberal ideas of limited government, individual rights, and requiring wealth and education as requisites for political participation, voting, or service. Now, how did they fix three challenges, or how did they address these three challenges? Um, well, essentially, they established the Committee of Public Safety, 12 men who basically came together as the executive body in this phase, in the radical phase of the revolution. They were led by Maximilien Robespierre, but they acted initially April 20th. They declared 1792. They declared war on Austria and Prussia. The Paris mob on August 10th, 1792, stormed the royal palace, that is the Tuileries. They seized the king, the minister of justice, Danton, Georges Danton, purged thousands of presumed traitors. He established the revolutionary tribunals, and he took action in drastic radical action against the presumed traitors. Then the National Legislative Assembly collapsed and was replaced by a national convention, a one-seat legislature. It was the Constitution of 1791 was replaced by the Constitution of the year 2. And this Constitution established universal male suffrage. That is, all French men could vote, regardless of property and education. The three steps that they took to stop, to address the three problems, the war, the internal opposition, and the collapsing economy, were the following. That is the levée en masse, right? They established the first national military draft, so that the French armies went from about 1 million to 5 million. And they established price controls, the law of maximum, which was less effective, but nonetheless, it did kind of establish public control over the economy. And they established the law of suspects, and the revolutionary tribunals that had been established by Danton received wide authority to prosecute and execute the enemies of the state. They tried to crush the counter-revolutionary revolt in the Vendée. It was very, very bloody, rather savage fighting. But they were able to succeed in most of these things. In the war, they stabilized the borders. They won important victories at Valmy and at Fleurus, and they were able to restore the economy with the law of maximums. They at least got important commodities back into Paris, and they also were able to effectively suppress internal opponents of the state. So by 17, so a 2-year period, 1792 to 1794, which is often known as the Reign of Terror, proved this, successful in many ways for the radicals, to the point where they weren't needed, and the level of tension and political oppression that the Committee of Public Safety had engaged in, and was continuing to engage in, terrified many of its own, and in fact, they were executing some of their own. In fact, the leaders of the Girondist faction were executed. People like Camille Desmoulins and Georges Danton, a radical minister of justice and firebrand, was also executed late in the period. And he basically prophesied that Robespierre was going to follow him. And indeed he did. On July 28th, 1794, Robespierre was executed in the famous Thermidorian reaction. This ended the radical phase, and it led to the next phase, which was that of the Directory. The Directory, again, new constitution, year 3, the Constitution of year 3, and established a bicameral legislature, now modeled on the ancient Athenian, at least named after the ancient Athenian system of the Council of Ancients and the Council of 500. This phase, though, was characterized by general incompetence, political and ideological infighting. It was also characterized by significant corruption, the XYZ affair in American history involving Foreign Minister Charles Maurice Talleyrand, that chameleon and survivor, and his demand for a bribe to settle disputes with the United States serves as a very good example of the corruption. And it proved incompetent in losing the initiative back from and giving it back to the royalists and the armies of the royalists in Europe, who won victories. In fact, the Austrians and the Russians were able to retake northern Italy from the French, and eventually required Napoleon to intervene in 1796 and 1797 in northern Italy and defeat the Austrians, forcing a peace on the Austrians that, again, stopped even the possible invasion of France, and gave Napoleon the first kind of independent command of a major military force, although he had gained that because on October 5th, 1795, Napoleon was able to stop a royalist mob from overthrowing the Directory. With a whiff of grape shot, he basically used cannon to crush this royalist mob. But by 1797, as I said, Napoleon had the command of the army of Italy, and proved to be quite successful in brilliant maneuvers to defeat the Austrians. He gained popularity and fame to the point where he was able to demand a command for Egypt. He basically argued that he could attack Egypt and threaten British India, and therefore force the British to come to the table. the British would remain a determined opponent to the French Revolution and its Napoleonic phase as well. But Napoleon did enter Egypt, defeated the Ottoman armies, the Mamluk armies there, and actually began modern Egyptology. As you know, the Rosetta Stone was found during the Napoleonic campaign, where he brought scientists and other important academics to study Egypt while he was there. Napoleon, though, had to flee Egypt and return to Paris when the British fleet basically defeated the French fleet at Abu Qir Bay and threatened to isolate the French army. Napoleon basically ran the blockade and made it back to Paris in 1799. And then November 9th, 1799, Napoleon's coup d'etat, the coup d'etat Brumaire, abolished the directory and established the consulate. And most people were asking for a brusque break with the directory by this time. So the consulate, and by the way, it's very interesting to note that a Napoleonic historiography, particularly French Napoleonic historiography, always sees the consulate as very progressive, very positive. The changes that Napoleon makes are significant, they're consequential. I think you could well argue that they basically create the framework for the modern state. And then French historiography sees the empire from 1804 to 1815 as less progressive, more problematic. But let's deal with the consulate. So 1799 to 1804, the last phase of the French Revolution was marked by a restoration of the initial revolutionary coalition. That's the important, I think that's the most important contribution of the Napoleonic phase to the consolidation of the revolution. That is, Napoleon was able to restore that initial broad coalition that supported the revolution, or at least the goals of the revolution. He was essentially able to bring the peasantry back. He was able to do that by restoring the Catholic Church, not to its official and singular role in France, but as the religion of the majority of the French. In fact, in his negotiations for the Concordat with Pope Pius, he resisted attempts by the Pope to restore Roman Catholicism as the official religion of France, establishing religious freedom, freedom of conscience, as a principle of the revolution and a principle of French government from there on. And he was able to do that quite successfully. He was also able to get the Pope to agree to recognition of the sale of church lands, which had taken place back in the moderate period of the revolution. They had taken the 10% of the land owned by the church, appropriated it, and sold it in auctions to the public. So that many peasants actually bought church lands and were very grateful that Napoleon was able to get church approval of that sale. So he was able to do two things: get the approval of the church for church lands, and also establish freedom of religion with the Concordat. He also then reformed the tax rolls, centralized collection, and established the Bank of France. And then established one of his greatest achievements is the Civil Code, which brought legal unity to the French nation and became the basis for legal codes throughout the world from that point on. It established equality before the law for all French citizens, and established careers open to ability. That is, careers no longer limited by the feudal order, but open to all on the basis of ability. He also reformed the middle school system, that is the high school system, the lycée of France, and the university system. And his nephew, Napoleon III, would establish free public education when he became the ruler of France in the mid-19th century. So Napoleon also made peace with Austria and Britain, the Treaty of Amiens, and he basically extended the Concordat with the Roman Catholic Church with additional agreements with Protestants and Jews. He basically dissolved legal disabilities against Jews, bringing them into the French public arena as equal citizens, if somewhat berated citizens. This is basically what he did after he became first consul of France, and basically enacted the Constitution of the year 8. And this was a executive of 3 consuls, and also had several legislative bodies, the legislative corps, the Senate, and the tribunate, and they were elected by a system of cooptation and elections limited to 10% of the notables in each of the different departments that sent representatives to either the legislative corps, the Senate, and the tribunate. The Senate was also staffed through cooptation. That is, an individual was co-opted into the Senate on the basis of his achievements. All these things he was able to do, and then in 1802, there was a plebiscite where Napoleon won basically the extended term for life. The consulate, when it was established, called for a 10-year term in 1802, and there had been a plebiscite. Again, Napoleon got 99% of the vote in both plebiscites. It was probably manipulated, no doubt. It was that level of approval was unlikely, but nonetheless, most historians I think, agree that Napoleon had at least 60 to 70% of the vote, and kind of based that on the fact that his nephew, Louis Napoleon, when he ran for president in 1848, got 70% of the popular vote just using the name Bonaparte and the legacy of his uncle. So I think most historians agree that Napoleon had overwhelming political support on the basis of his achievements. That it rose to 99%, not likely. It was essentially rigged, but he would have won without having to rig any election at that time. So between and then in 1804, of course, Napoleon crowns himself emperor, establishes an imperial constitution, again approved by plebiscite. And again, you can see how, although he did this, how he was opposed by the forces of Europe. The monarchies of Europe never really accepted Napoleon, even though Napoleon tried to consolidate the gains of the revolution within an overall monarchic system. It was constitutional monarchy, although autocratic, but the monarchy, the framework of monarchy was, I think, designed to allay the fears of the other monarchs in Europe, but they were never those fears were never allayed, and they wouldn't be until the mid 19th century. French victories, though, basically allowed Napoleon to restructure the map of Europe, and wherever he went, he consolidated governments, he modernized governments, he eliminated the feudal systems, and he was able to dominate Europe. Of course, Britain was a tough nut to crack because of its island, uh, its island character, and its royal navy. And Napoleon had to turn to economic warfare, which proved unsuccessful, and it led to the two wars that Napoleon really started. Every other war was declared against Napoleon. There were two of them that Napoleon declared. That is the war against Spain in 1808 and the war against Russia in 1812, both in the service of this continental system that Napoleon had established to wage economic warfare against the British. He needed to bring the British to the table. There was only one way to reach Great Britain, and he thought, and it was based on economic warfare. A European-wide boycott of British trade, he thought would bring Britain to the table in order to maintain that European-wide boycott. He had to basically have the entire coast of Europe under his control, and particularly Russia, who was determined to not to follow him. So it broke a treaty with Napoleon, and Napoleon, in order to force Russia back into the continental system, invaded. About 600,000 men went in, only about 40,000 came out. And then from that point on, Napoleon fought the Sixth Coalition. You see, all the way from the First Coalition to the Sixth Coalition, which was determined to stop him. Again, he proved militarily brilliant on the battlefield, and he was able to hold off much superior armies throughout. But at the end of the day, he was brought down. He was forced to abdicate in 1814. He was placed on the island of Elba, and he was able to restructure the island very quickly. He was allowed a 1,000-man guard. He escaped, and he came back to France. He was able to take over France again. So it speaks to the wide support for Napoleon, who had led the nation through 14 years of war, and a nation that had suffered 10 years before that under the Republic of War. So, but he still had significant support. He was able to kind of restructure that initial revolutionary coalition that remained in place until his final defeat in 1815 at Waterloo. Louis the 18th was restored. A Congress of Vienna reestablished traditional monarchies. A European balance of power was established at the Congress of Vienna under the leadership of the Austrian Chancellor Clemens von Metternich. A conservative order descended on Europe, and it ended the period of the French Revolution per se, but not its consequences. Its consequences would remain in place and shape the modern world. Well, again, I will show you the imperial oath of the Constitution of the year 12, which is the imperial constitution. And as you can see, although an autocratic system, the Napoleonic system was essentially a constitutional monarchy. He's very clear about that. He was determined to represent a consolidation of the French Revolution, a consolidation that would not have taken place without his leadership and military abilities. And he did so without recourse to terror or the guillotine. So you can see what Europe looked like in 1789 and what Europe looked like in 1812. And then finally, what Europe looked like in the aftermath of Napoleon's defeat. And this was the settlement of Vienna under Metternich, the restoration, but not a complete restoration. For example, the German Confederation was 38 states that made up Germany, as opposed to the 300 that had made up Germany the German territory before 1789. Napoleon had reformed the German states and had reduced them from 300 to about 38. And the German Confederation that emerged after the Congress of Vienna under Metternich and Austria's domination basically preserved the framework that Napoleon had established. And by 1848, this entire system would be challenged, and there would be a new Napoleon by 1851, new Napoleon on the throne of France, and nationalism would dominate the next 100 years after. Well, thank you very much. I'm going to end uh, podcast here. And again, if you like it, please give it a like and please comment on it. I would appreciate your commentary.